I'm Adam Pasquarella, and welcome to episode 45 of The Power of Bold.
From New York City, it's The Power of Bold, the podcast on risk-taking, entrepreneurship, and bold living. Join us as we interview world-class performers, analyse life-changing books, and gather actionable insights to help you achieve your goals. Here's your host, Adam Pasquarella.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to this latest episode of The Power of Bold. For this episode, we're going to take a deep dive into two topics that I am truly obsessed with. They are leadership lessons and Game of Thrones. Right now we're in the thick of the final season of Game of Thrones. I'm recording this after the third of 6 total episodes this season. It has been a great season so far, and I can't wait to actually see who sits in the Iron Throne in a few weeks. But regardless of whoever ends up on top, I believe that Game of Thrones is much more about dragons or battles. It is about power, human nature, and leadership. There is so much we can learn from Game of Thrones, whether we are fans of the show or not. Because of this, I'm really excited to share our latest interview with Bruce Craven. Bruce is a member of the Columbia University Business School and is the program director of the Advanced Management Program. He teaches the popular MBA/EMBA elective called Leadership Through Fiction, and he recently released a book titled Win or Die: Leadership Secrets from Game of Thrones. In my conversation with Bruce, we touched on some of these leadership secrets and how we can apply them to our own lives. Some points of discussion included how Sansa Stark transformed into one of the most important and powerful characters in the show, two of the most adaptable characters in Westeros, how Daenerys Targaryen can do a better job as a leader, and who would be the most satisfying winner of the Iron Throne from a leadership perspective. Like I said, I recorded my interview with Bruce after the 3rd episode this season, so the situation in the show may have drastically changed when you listen to this episode. Also, we try to keep spoilers at this point to a minimum, but if you are worried about potential spoilers, I would probably recommend that you watch up to episode 3 of this last season first, before listening to the episode. So with all of that said, let's get to my conversation with Bruce Craven. Bruce Craven, thanks for joining me on The Power of Bold.
Thank you, Adam. I'm glad to be here.
Well, I'm so excited to have you here for a number of reasons here. First, we're in the thick of the final season of Game of Thrones, which so many people like me are drinking up. I think it's a fabulous, fabulous season so far. But along with that, your book touches on subjects that cater to the heart of the podcast. So I'm happy to have you on. But before we get into the book and, how we can apply lessons from Game of Thrones to our own careers, I'd like to start by talking about you, your work, and your interest in the series. So first, I really think that you've built this unique bridge between business and fiction, and I think that's pretty awesome. And fiction as far as novels, movies, and television shows. And you even launched a course at Columbia University called Leadership Through Fiction, where you use fiction to study leadership lessons. So can you tell the listeners how this interest in the intersection between fiction and leadership came about? Was it something you were always interested in, or did it develop over time?
Yeah, Greg, great question, Adam. I came to New York as a 25-year-old graduate student many decades ago in the 80s to study poetry at Columbia School of the Arts. And after getting a Master of Fine Arts in Poetry and creating a poetry manuscript and then pursuing some work as a novelist, along that way, I started working at Columbia Business School in what's called the Executive Education Department. And that very much involves courses that have a strong component in management and also in leadership. And as, the 90s developed, I was pursuing other novel writing. I was pursuing screenwriting in Hollywood. And I also was returning to New York often and spending time there, continuing to work in those programs. So I was leading really a dual life. On one side, I was with business people, men and women from all around the world, numerous industries, any culture you could imagine. And I was also in both New York and LA, spending a lot of time around people in the entertainment industry and the publishing industry. And I had a few professors and consultants recommend that I ought to find a way to bring those two worlds together. And in the 90s, it was interesting because it was a wonderful, sharp, insightful, creative idea. And as we sometimes do, I ignored it. I thought, oh, those two worlds aren't together. They're separate worlds. And I kept working on my writing, and I kept working in executive education. And then really right around the time of 9/11, I had this big aha where I realized if I was going to continue in the business education field, I needed to find a way to work as a teacher. The teaching was the part that really energized me. And so it was natural that I started developing content that built on my experiences as a writer. So I created a workshop that was focused around, very loosely around Joseph Campbell's hero's journey model. And I started teaching that to executives from all around the world. I took it when I traveled to different locations. I taught it in Armenia to the Central Bank of Armenia. I taught it in Germany to graduate business students. And along the way, I wrote a business case with a colleague at Columbia Business School. And when I was writing the case, I was trying to bring some creativity to the process. And the case was about a building supply company in the United States. It was about the credit function in the building supply company. It was about a leadership challenge that the leader of the credit function had around developing the right organizational structure to achieve the strategy from his headquarters in London. When I finished that project, I thought, there's got to be a way to get at some of these leadership ideas through the use of fiction.
Sure.
Through films, novels, plays, even poetry. And I floated the idea very quickly to the dean of the business school, and he was positive about it. But I was living in California. The business school was in New York. The logistics were a little intimidating to me. And what I didn't know was that someone at Harvard, Joseph Badaracco, had already started to teach a course that was structured around that same concept. So long story short, I had a moment where I heard that they were looking for a new course at Columbia, and I kind of stepped out of my hesitancy. I was bold, to use an important word, and I called decision makers, and I pitched why I should be given this opportunity, and they agreed, and really with no honest preparation time, I was jumping on a plane in the summer of 2012, and I was flying back and forth every week. So I would fly to New York, work on my PowerPoint and my course structure, get to the hotel, fall asleep, get up, deliver the class, fly back. And I did that all through the summer of 2012, really developing the content kind of on the fly. And it went over really well. And then I kept doing it, sort of adjusted different books, different films. And then along the way, an editor approached me. This was about 5 years ago, and said, have you thought about connecting this to this new popular show called Game of Thrones? And I'd only seen one episode. So the idea honestly kind of intimidated me. I knew it was very popular. It was an interesting genre, this epic fantasy genre. And I just said yes and jumped into it. And without going into all the details, it took us about 4 years. In fact, we moved to another publishing house. And then about 4 years later, we actually got a contract signed in the fall of 2017. And then I wrote the book last year while keeping up with my actually very hectic teaching and travel schedule. So it was an idea that was brought to me because of an idea that I had developed to teach leadership through fiction, unknowing that another professor had also kind of come up with that idea. And at the end of the day, it was something that I realized my probably best moments were eventually listening to people that brought me good ideas. So someone brought me an idea that I should bring my creative writing experience into executive education. And it took me a while to make that decision, but then I did. An editor came to me and said, have you thought of Game of Thrones? And to my credit, even though it was intimidating, and even though it took 4 years to get the contract in hand, I jumped into it, and so by the time I had the opportunity to write the book, I was pretty well versed in the subject.
It was the first episode of Thrones. I'm assuming it was the pilot that you saw. So you had that one under your belt, and you were thinking, oh, maybe this will work, maybe this wouldn't. Why do you think Game of Thrones is so insightful about leadership? Because I think if you ask the layperson, or even my general impression about Thrones, or even shows like House of Cards, is that all of these shows are about power. They're about ruthless people that want to get power by whatever means necessary. It's almost Machiavellian in that way. First of all, I guess, do you think that's fair? And second, whether it is or isn't, why is Thrones such a good series to learn about leadership?
I think you're right on target. I think it's successful in my mind for the same reason that Shakespeare has been successful for centuries. It is about power. And it's not just about it's not just about the people that will do anything and trade any kind of moral position for their own narcissistic power, because there are certainly those characters in Game of Thrones. You know, your Petyr Baelish, and we'll see what finally happens with Cersei. But those are characters that clearly put their individual power above the power of everyone else. But it's also about the power of people like Daenerys, who insists, I want to break the wheel. I want to stop the cycle that has kept the impoverished and the vulnerable crushed for centuries. I want to find some way to liberate people. It's also about, a Jon Snow who confronts power with a focus on leveraging and supporting his colleagues and direct reports in the Night's Watch, who comes up with the big idea to bring the wildlings across the wall, and who's assassinated for it. Who feels the power of betrayal and chooses to come back and chooses to put himself at risk again. I would argue because he recognizes that his siblings are still alive and he feels a love for them and wants to defend his community, which is what guides Sansa. So you have all these people working in an environment where the power is, put it this way, where power is not a choice. I mean, or you could choose to try to ignore the power, and then you're just putting yourself in a vulnerable victim situation. Or you could be like Sansa, go through incredible suffering and recognize that you're going to come back and fight for the things that matter to you. So I think, yes, it's very much about power, and it's also very much about high stakes. So the power is part of the equation, and high stakes are part of the equation. If you sit back and choose not to compete, you're going to lose in a big way in Game of Thrones. And so I think all of us watch it and we recognize some parallels to our own lives. I mean, if we sit back and don't make some big courageous decisions, opportunity is going to pass us by.
Yeah, and I think you bringing up Sansa in relation to that is super insightful. And for me, reading the book and watching the show, I think her transformation is the most stark. No pun intended there. Yeah. But it's just amazing what she goes through. Like you said, the suffering, and now she is taking such a huge leadership role. I was going to ask you about that later, but if I can get to it now, how do you think?
Sure.
How do you think that really happens in a person? I mean, I'm going back to seasons 1 and 2. You could tell that her goal was, I don't know if her goal was to take a passive approach to life, but that was what was happening. She wanted to get married to someone in King's Landing and live happily ever after, so to speak. But what really changed in her mind that made her take ownership? Was it just the fact that she was suffering so much? And I guess, what can we learn from that and apply to our own lives?
Yeah, I think when I think of Sansa, who I find just an incredibly admirable and inspiring character at this point in the narrative, at the beginning, when she's this, young woman in Winterfell, she's been taught a story by the Septas, the teachers. She has been taught about this history of Westeros, the glamour, the heroism, and she's bought into it 100%. She sees handsome Prince Joffrey, and she believes that his surface appearance, which she finds appealing, projects his inner core, which she assumes is going to be appealing and heroic. And even when Prince Joffrey, attempts to beat Micah the butcher's boy with a sword and proves to be a bully, and at the same time simultaneously proves to be a coward. And even when Queen Cersei maneuvers to where Sansa's direwolf lady is executed by her own father, Sansa still tries to cling to this idea that, you know, everything's going to be good in King's Landing. Mm-hmm. Everything's going to be as heroic and as kind of systematically understandable and positive as she was taught to believe it would be if she behaved correctly. Then she gets to King's Landing, and if you remember, there's the big jousting scene, and you know, she's being charmed by, I think it's the Knight of Flowers, if my memory's correct. But at a certain point, her father sends Beric Dondarrion out on the command to find the mountain and capture him. And she's a little upset that it's not the Knight of Flowers, because he's the more handsome one. And if the mountain is really the monster, the most handsome knight should be sent. So she's thought into this idea, right? Mm-hmm. And very quickly, this illusion evaporates right in front of her, and her father's beheaded. She's in, was it Maegor's Holdfast, or in the Battle of the Blackwater, and Cersei is getting drunk and basically telling her, that guy over there holding the sword, the headsman, is here to finish us off if we're about to be assaulted by the enemy. And then shortly after that, she escapes, believing it's the drunken knight who has liberated her, and then finds out that it's Littlefinger, and Littlefinger basically gives her this message that, you know, you have a choice to be a player or a piece, you know, a game piece. And she recognizes that she's been a game piece. And Sansa learns from some pretty difficult people. I mean, Cersei, Littlefinger, but along the way she does learn. And you have that dramatic moment with Littlefinger where she says, "It's true, I'm slow to learn, it's true, but I do learn."
Right.
And to answer your question specifically, what happens with her is that she's bought into this fantasy, and the fantasy unveils itself to be a living nightmare, and she finds this inner strength to survive it and to have the courage to escape, because she wants to make it back to her home, and she wants to defend her home. So she finds a purpose that's larger than her fear, and she finds a way to really she identifies something she's concerned and willing to die for, as opposed to sit there and buy into a fantasy and be a piece, a game piece.
Mm-hmm. I guess extrapolating that into our own lives or listeners' lives, is there a way where we can learn that lesson without undergoing maybe not as much suffering she did, or having our paradigm shifted that much? But is there a way we can be proactive about being a player and not a piece, like you say?
Yeah, well, I believe strongly that that's one of the gifts that fiction gives us. It gives us the chance to immerse into these stories, these narratives, and read about different characters, and read about their challenges and often their horrible sufferings, and then go back to ourselves and ask ourselves tough questions. You know, am I right now Sansa in Winterfell, buying into the myths that surround me? And am I vulnerable to my willingness to accept promises and half-truths from people who have their own self-interest in mind? Or am I maybe becoming closer to the Sansa who recognizes what matters to me in my life and is willing to go fight for it? And if the answer is, I don't know what matters to me in my life right now, that's perfectly valid. Then the bold question would be, what can I do now to identify what matters to me in my life, so that if I get into these difficult situations where I have to make hard choices, I'm prepared to do it. Part of it was that Sansa was easily manipulated because she had not developed, and you can't blame her, she's a very young woman, but she hadn't developed the perspective to be able to see past the illusion. So to me, one of the takeaways for her would be, what can we do to try to see more clearly so that we have agency and we're not vulnerable to people manipulating us?
Exactly. And so it sounds like being reflective is one tactic, constantly questioning where you are and almost where,
yeah. and I would add, sorry, I am interrupting. I would add recognizing in that reflection a responsibility to be proactive and to try to understand the context of the world around you with more clarity, which she does do, and to recognize your own responsibility to be resilient when the story you've been telling yourself falls apart. Because sometimes the story we've been telling ourselves maybe has been helpful to get us to a certain point, and then maybe we can't control everything around us. We can't control people's choices, the people we love, people we work for. At a certain point, our reality may be shattered by things out of our control. And can we find the resilience to lead ourselves? I mean, I write about this in the book on the chapter about Sansa. Can we find a way to be gritty and a way to be resilient, a way to lead ourselves past that?
Absolutely. And I think this is a good segue into another lesson you provide in the book, which is leading with adaptability. Sansa, maybe she was slower than others, as she says in season 7, I think, but she ultimately is adaptable and she adapts to the situation at hand. And in that chapter of your book, I believe you mentioned Cersei Lannister and Petyr Baelish being some of the most adaptable in Westeros. And full disclosure, I think a lot of people hate Petyr Baelish for a number of good reasons, but I personally think he's one of the most fascinating characters. I'm really sad that he's gone. I hope there's some, possibility he could come back. I kind of doubt it. There are some theories on the internet that he could, but I don't think it's going to happen. but why are Cersei and Petyr Baelish so adaptable? Can you maybe share some examples of that?
Well, I think both of them, they're very proactive and they're very intelligent and they're very courageous. Petyr Baelish recognized early on when he attempted to win Catelyn Stark's hand and her fiance, I believe it was Brandon Stark, Ned Stark's older brother, kind of beat the crap out of him. He realized that, defending himself in a warrior way in a warrior society was not going to be his way forward. And he, to, I think, his discredit, eventually became narcissistically manipulative. But if you want to look at what he did right, he was very strategic. He could build alliances with people. At the end of the day, he would betray those people. And so I think that kind of catches up with him. But his capacity to be strategic, his capacity to see past his flaws and try to identify his strengths is admirable. And Cersei, to me, and they're both really fabulous characters. I mean, and I think part of what that is because they're very human. I mean, who hasn't had an affection or an attraction to some cause and then attempted to win it in some way, whether it's romance or a career, and been beaten down? I mean, people have that happen all the time, and Petyr doesn't let it stop it, right? And Cersei, in a family of leaders, her father being the former hand of the king to King Aerys before Robert's Rebellion, she's raised in an environment where every man around her assumes her job is to go marry someone and have children. And she redefines that and wants to be a leader. She fundamentally adapts to the way the Westeros world is presented her choices. I think with Cersei, you've got someone who she decided she wanted to be a leader and she makes it happen. Now, along the way, I think she's not able, at least at the moment, from what we can tell, she doesn't able to see past her own desire to be the person at the top. Yet you have to give her credit for the courage and for her ability to not. She continues to find options. Of course, she blows up the Septa Baylor. And a lot of innocent people die in that. But I think if you're looking at it as fiction and extracting some wisdom from it, you could say, hey, this is a character that keeps finding their way forward against great odds. Another person I would bring in for adaptability is Samwell Tarly, in the sense that he arrives at Castle Black, gets beat up by, I think it's Halder when they're sparring. Jon Snow says, "Don't worry, you'll do better tomorrow," and he says, "I never do better." Right? I mean, he's got he's got no optimism at that moment about his potential to change. And within, a certain amount of time, he's got a woman who he's in love with. He's killed a White Walker and a thin warg. He's cured Jorah Mormont of grayscale. I mean, his ability to adapt past what terrified him is also pretty admirable.
And part of being adaptable is anticipating what's going to happen around the corner. I mean, maybe you won't know with certainty what's going to happen, but at least with Cersei and Petyr Baelish and Samwell, like you say, maybe him to a lesser extent, but it seems like they're almost odds making the future. There's a 70% chance this is going to happen, so I need to allocate time to that and everything. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say that's a great point about Cersei and Petyr Baelish. They are focused on what's around the corner,
right?
And maybe that focus at times is not anchored in any other moral concern. But for us in our world, if we could remind ourselves that there are ways to see around the corner and there's ways we can assess the environment so that we're not surprised by everything, that's a good takeaway.
Exactly. And even though Petyr Baelish did die in the last season, perhaps the odds of his death were at maybe like a 10 or 5%, and that was a good risk to take. It just didn't work out for him. Maybe that's how he would spin it. I'm not not entirely sure. But at least for us, learning from this adaptability point, how can we really break through inertia, whether that's in our career or personal lives, and just adapt to our circumstances? I guess this is going to what we discussed a few minutes ago. But these characters, Cersei and Petyr Baelish, they seem either naturally good at it or they've worked to improve this skill. Do you have any insight on how we can do the same?
Well, I mean, to me, there's a concept we use a lot, and it's actually almost identical to the player versus the piece concept that Baelish shares with Sansa. We use a concept in executive education, player versus victim. It's the same thing. The victim is the game piece, right? But in player versus victim, we always have agency. We always have choice, each one of us. It doesn't mean that our choices are going to always deliver what we want. And it doesn't mean that we're not going to face great trials and great suffering, but we do have choice on how we confront obstacles. And in all of our careers, we have been, or we certainly are going to be tested. And if you look at Cersei and Petyr Baelish, they know that's the norm. They know they're going to be tested. They do not fall into some comfort zone of assuming everything's going to be okay. And I'm sure, our listeners have had this experience. I've worked with a few people who they bring that laser-like focus every day to work. And sometimes it can be a little draining, but sometimes it's incredibly energizing because they're able to look at kind of this morass, this unpredictable environment and see through it and decide where they have choices to impact it. I work with a professor who very much has that approach, and there's a tenacity there. And you see that with Cersei and with Baelish. I'd say with Samwell Tarly, what you see at a certain point is he's got this pessimistic view of the world when he meets Jon Snow that is holding him back, understandably. His own father threatened to kill him if he didn't leave and join the Night's Watch. But when he gets to the Night's Watch, and this is with the help of Jon, he starts becoming engaged with the world. Mm-hmm. And so to answer your question in kind of a slightly different way, when we're at those moments where we are feeling disengaged or overwhelmed, or, what can we do to leverage some optimism in us? And often it's about finding a way to care for something bigger than ourselves, whether it's the purpose of a new career, or whether it's people in our lives that matter to us, whether it's a cause. And I don't think you can artificially just generate that on a whim at the end of a busy day, but I think we can spend our lives with some level of awareness. Hey, what matters to me, and what am I willing to fight for? And in an equation of player versus victim, or what are we willing to fight for? And player versus victim, at a certain point, when are you going to make some brave choices and some bold choices to achieve something that matters to you, and why? And I know that's often helped me get past moments of fear, moments of intimidation, is just recognizing there's some things I want to fight for. And if I lose fighting for them, that's better than if I don't fight for them.
And also with that, there's a strategic way to use your values, I guess is another word to say that. And you spend the first chapter of the book talking about not being like Ned Stark because he was so tied to his own values and he couldn't see the values in others and adapt to them. Is that a fair argument?
Yeah. I would add from the adaptability perspective, Ned's what I think the mistake Ned makes is not that he has strong values and not that he believes in his values, but that he's very quick to judge what he believes he understands about other people's values.
Right.
So to get to your question of, our larger goal of adaptability, to me, and I'm, 58 years old, and so I think I've gone through some experiences over the years, both positive ones and times I've made mistakes. And I think quick judgment of people is something that sometimes you need to do. If you're in a certain environment, you've got to trust your instinct. Yet to fall into that comfort zone of judging a variety of people very quickly, I think is dangerous. I think you can very quickly close yourself off to potential allies. I think you can assume people's goodwill far past anything they've maybe proven. And so I think an important part of adaptability is not tricking yourself into judging people in too superficial of a way.
Mm-hmm. And the only way to get better is through experience, I'm assuming, just as far as speed of judgment and all that.
Yeah, I would add, absolutely. I mean, although I don't know that at 58 I'm better at it than I was at 20. I do think listening helps, and I think being present with people and really paying attention to their body language and the context of the situation, what they're saying. I think what we all fall into very quickly, either accepting bad advice from people in our life and then just following it blindly. We can fall into the trap of not really listening to people and kind of, the concept of confirmation bias. Oh, they're acting this way. And so, I was expecting them to act this way. And now I just saw something that confirms it. And I'm sure they're this way, as opposed to, regardless of your age, regardless of your experience, can you really practice being present, listening, and holding back on simple judgments, which could get you into trouble and lose you opportunities to adapt? If Ned Stark, put it in the Game of Thrones lens, if Ned Stark had been able to recognize that Lord Varys was an ally earlier, he might not have found it out from Lord Varys by the time he was already trapped in one of the black cells.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. If I can ask you just about this season, I know it's not in the book, and this is being released in a couple days here after episodes 4, so I hope this isn't too outdated. But just for this season, the interplay between Daenerys Targaryen and the Starks, I think, is really interesting, just because she's a new leader coming to Winterfell. She's obviously John bent the knee, so to speak, and Sansa seems to recognize the writing on the wall. I believe she even said Winterfell is yours. She calls Daenerys her queen, these sort of things. But you can sense the underlying tension there and the uncertainty about what's going to happen after the battles are over. So as far as from Daenerys' perspective, and I guess a perspective even from a listener who's maybe going into a new job and has a leadership role, how can you be a better leader in those circumstances?
So how can Daenerys be a better leader in those circumstances?
Yeah, or just building goodwill amongst the Starks. Just because John bent the knee, and I don't think they really liked that decision, or obviously had any say in that decision. And so there's a new ruler that's come in, or a new boss, or a new manager. How does the manager or boss build goodwill in that situation?
Yeah, I think Daenerys is facing a challenge that many leaders face, and you don't probably even have to be that high up in an organization to face a parallel decision. Parallel situation. She's got overwhelmed. She recognizes that the stakes are as severe as they can be, as do Jon, as did Sansa. And now, after the last episode, I don't know how much we should reveal, but after the last episode, we're in a situation where, as much as maybe one problem is less critical, a whole nother set of problems is more critical. And she's got to decide what's the right step forward, because she has all these followers who have devoted and risked their lives to be there with her, not to mention all the people that died in support of her promised effort to break the wheel. So she's got a huge responsibility on her, long and short. And yet, if she just drives forward without fulfilling, she has an obligation to continue to build followership. And one of the things that Daenerys has been great at from her earliest days as a Khaleesi on the Dothraki Sea is she's been great at gaining the followership of people who believe in her. Mm-hmm. And now she's in a situation where she doesn't have much of an army left, right? And she's lost a lot of her resources, and she's got a very real enemy to the south. And she's found out that her claim on her official claim to her leadership is probably not valid.
Yeah.
So how does she go into that environment and still pursue the goals that she has been aggressively pursuing all the way from, as Khaleesi through Koth, through Meereen and Slaver's Bay and Dragonstone and Westeros? How does she follow that when everything has changed? And I think many leaders face a very similar dynamic where you feel you have all these great resources and suddenly they're gone. You feel like you have a certain authority and then maybe people question it. And it will be interesting to see what decisions she makes to find a way to build her followership as she goes forward. I of course, don't know the answer, but I think it's going to be something around, if she's successful, it's going to be around gaining people's commitment to a common goal, whether that common goal is breaking the wheel as she's used in the past, or it's something slightly different. It's going to be, she's got to build people's commitment to where she's going, or she might adapt her commitment to a different leader.
Yeah. And so if you were the hand of the queen, that's exactly what you would tell her if you were in Tyrion's position. Just, yeah.
I would be trying to encourage some level of recognizing everything she's achieved, and also recognizing that she can't will away the fact that the context has changed. Mm-hmm. The context has changed. And so as a leader, how are you going to go into that and understand your own emotions, understand the emotions of your followers, and make some key decisions about what you're going to do? Because it's just not the same world it was before, and she can't pretend that it is.
Right. Well, it's definitely going to be fascinating to see. We only have three episodes left, and if I could just ask you a couple of just quick rapid fire questions here to close it out. I'm not going to ask you just for a general prediction unless you want to provide it, but what would be the most satisfying conclusion to the series from a leadership standpoint? Do you have a sense of that?
Well, I might have an answer that actually covers both. And I was exchanging emails, I should say, with a Columbia professor today who I highly respect and who I referenced in the book. And, in my book is structured around Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. And in the hero's journey, there's this departure that characters go on. They've been given choices. They go on a departure. They face a whole array of challenges. They face internal doubts. They face external doubts. And in the end, they transform past the person they initially were into this new, it's really, in Joseph Campbell, it's kind of a spiritual transformation that allows them to live in the present, lead people in the present, but in some ways be elevated above kind of the messy neediness of the present. So it's this very spiritual journey kind of combined with a high-risk warrior journey combined with achievement. And the two people that I see, I've been quoted before as having strong confidence in the impact Sansa's going to have, and I still feel that way. The two people to me that seem the most likely in some way to fulfill Campbell's vision of the hero's journey are either Daenerys or Tyrion. And Tyrion is someone that has believed in the importance of leadership through his whole career, from when he was telling Lord Varys how he fixed the sewers in Casterly Rock, and when Lord Varys challenges him to travel to Meereen to kind of confront Daenerys and offer his support of her, he does it even against his own, desire to drink himself to death. So I guess I'm at a point where who knows what's going to happen. But I do see the two of them in different ways as representing a potential sort of completion to a journey where they have departed, they've gone against incredibly great risks, they've returned. And I think both of them need to go, if that were to happen, they need to go through some kind of transformation that hasn't happened yet.
Yeah.
Did I answer your question?
Yeah, no, you did. And I think that would be a satisfying ending, especially the Tyrion one. To be honest, I've been obsessed with the ending, and I've been looking at the betting odds to see who's favored to win the Iron Throne. And it looks like Jon Snow and Daenerys are the clear favorites, but Tyrion would be a cool twist, going forward.
He would be a twist. And Jon Snow, I'm sure, I knowing myself, I'm sure I would feel a bit of satisfaction, because he's, initially when I wrote this book, I think at one point I'd written like 8 chapters and they were all about Jon Snow. And at one point I thought, okay, I got to write about some other characters.
Well, speaking of that, who do you think is the best leader in the show, and who's the worst to this point?
Well, I mean, for me, if I were to look at leadership as it matters to me in my life, Cersei has accomplished a great amount, but to me, she at this point is a very she's unfulfilling to me as a leader, because she doesn't seem to be able to get past her simple desire to win for herself. So one of the things I'm interested in seeing in the final 3 episodes, is there any moment where she recognizes that leadership is about more than her, ability to stand at the top of the kingdom with a glass of red wine and sit in the Iron Throne. And I would love to see this moment where she realizes something that hasn't been provided to her by her father in the past, which is that leadership is about something more than yourself.
Right. Do you think that'll happen?
I have no idea.
Yeah.
But I've thought about it a lot. I want to see it happen.
Yeah, right.
And I think it's like in our own lives. I mean, we look at people, we want to see them make more human choices than their own self-aggrandizement. And that sometimes people surprise us, or sometimes people go through a transformation, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes they've defined their world as simply their own narcissistic success, and they live that way until the very end. To me, that if she does not make a choice beyond her own self-promotion, she's going to be a tragic leader that got very close and didn't figure it out. Daenerys has significantly, from her most vulnerable moment, chosen to try to build followership, as I said before. And if you go back to when she steps into the funeral pyre with Khal Drogo and with the screaming magi who, she's immolating to death, she knows that the quote in the book is, "If I look back, I am lost." Like, she knows she has to go forward to build the followership of the people she's going to need. And it's not just for her own success. I mean, till this point, everyone believes she cares about her followers. And so up to this point, I believe very strongly in her. And her actions have, with the exception maybe of the moment when she immolated the Tarlys with Dragonfire, I mean, in general, her decisions have been about living up to her values of supporting her followers. So I guess at this moment, she's my model of the hero who is the best leader.
Yeah, absolutely.
But will it survive three more episodes? I don't know.
Yeah, right. And finally, just the last question here. What is one decision that has been made in the series that you would redo, or what's the most glaring decision that should have been different from a leadership standpoint?
Well, I think I just was referring to the one that haunted me the most because it was just a difficult call. But when she had Randall Tarly and Randall's son Dickon in front of her, and she basically said, "Bend the knee," and Randall Tarly said, "I am under no obligation to do that." And then Tyrion said, "Oh, you could send him to the wall to take the black." It looked like she was considering it. And then Randall said, "You don't even have the right to send me to the wall." Her choice was, I think, a very Machiavellian choice where the ends justified the means of, if you're not going to give me any kind of way to work with you in front of all of these enemy soldiers, I'm going to sacrifice you in order to build my visible leadership strength over all these people and win the war. Right.
Yeah.
So she makes a very hard decision. To me, it was a decision that I have wondered for, I guess, a year and a half, if it's going to come back and haunt her, because so much of her moral strength has been her effort, not always perfect, but her effort to try to defend the vulnerable. And okay, so if she was executing Randall, maybe that was in support of it, but she also was executing his son, who clearly walked over and stood next to him because it was his father. And I feel like she had some moment there that she could have achieved her goals without that execution.
Right, and it has already had an effect this season. I think it's in episode 2 where she speaks with Samwell and the Crypts, and that information comes out. And he's not exactly happy with that. So maybe it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, if it does, in the last 3 episodes.
That's a great point. She's already lost. She's arguably, well, she's not arguably, she's undermined the relationship of someone we know could be an incredible resource to leaders, and she's hurt that for a very questionable reason in my mind. So that's a great point.
Right. Well, Bruce, this has been awesome. I love Game of Thrones. I can tell you clearly do as well. And there's a lot of leadership lessons that we can take from it. Again, the book is called Win or Die: Leadership Secrets from Game of Thrones. And if listeners want to learn more about you or the book, where can they go?
Well, I have a website, which is www.cravenleadership.com. And people can reach out to me on that. Of course, I'm on Instagram and Twitter. It's at LED, L-E-D, as in dog, Sofa, the license plate of my vintage car. So I'm on Instagram and Twitter. I've got the website. Love to hear from people, and I really appreciate the chance to be on the show, Adam.
Yeah, well, thanks again, Bruce. This has been an awesome discussion, and looking forward to the last 3 episodes here.
Cool. Everyone, be bold.
Thanks, Bruce. Once again, that was Bruce Craven, professor of Columbia University's Leadership Through Fiction course, and the author of Win or Die: Leadership Secrets from Game of Thrones. If you're interested in the series, interested in becoming a better, more effective leader, or both, I encourage you to check out the book. So that's it for this episode of The Power of Bold. Go to our website, thepowerofbold.com, for show notes and a transcript of this episode. And if you like what you heard, feel free to give us a review on Apple Podcasts. Every review helps others discover the show. With all that said, I'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Power of Bold. For show notes and a transcript of this episode, visit thepowerofbold.com. Feel free to get in touch by visiting our Facebook and Twitter pages. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or Google Play. We'll see you next time.